My wife is a huge Harry Potter fan. When we first started dating, she wanted to make sure that I knew the story of Harry Potter. In fact, the final movie of Harry Potter was about to come out, so she wanted me to catch up and to know the storyline before we watched the final movie together. The problem is that I didn't like to read. So I said I was going to read all the books, but instead I was going to watch all the movies up to that point. And to my surprise, Harry Potter was amazing. There were so many twists and turns to the storyline that sometimes I would forget that in the middle of the second movie, I would get a little afraid that Harry Potter might die. But then I'll remember that there's many more installments to come. Harry's gonna survive until the end. So clearly, he'll get through whatever situation he was going through. Now, looking back at the story of Harry Potter, I noticed that there's a parallel between the story of the Bible and Harry Potter. In other words, after finishing all the movies, I started to look back at the previous movies and notice all the clues that pointed to its ending. Now at this point, I'm going to let you know, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched Harry Potter, then you can skip through this section. But let me show you how there's a parallel between Harry Potter and the Bible. You see, Harry Potter was known as the boy who lived. His mother was murdered by Voldemort while Harry somehow survived. They later discovered that Voldemort formed Horcruxes to hide fragments of his soul into different things to become immortal, and the creation of a Horcrux involves a spell and the horrific act of murder. Out of the 8 Harry Potter movies, it wasn't until the 6th movie when we finally realized that Harry Potter was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, which meant that Harry himself needed to die so that his enemy will be put to death forever. From the very beginning of this series, the clues were all there that led to the point that Harry must die to save the rest of the world. You see, in the same way, I believe that when we study the Bible, we get caught up in the details and lose sight of the big story. And I believe that this is a reason why many of us get confused about the Bible. And so for this lesson, here's the main point I want to drive home. You must understand the main message of the Bible. You must understand the storyline of the Bible to clearly understand the details of the Bible. And once you understand the main message of the Bible, you can look back and see all the clues that were pointing to this main message in the end. The very first sin recorded in the Bible is when the serpent tempted Adam and Eve to question God's word. And this leads to the 2 responses we today can have to God's word. What is truth? Has God said? And finally, God has not said, or God has said, based on how we define truth. And so from Genesis 3 forward, we see that everything has changed in the storyline of the Bible. What God made perfect and whole has now been broken by sin. And so from this point forward, the one word that summarizes the rest of the Bible is actually not salvation, it's restoration. God is in the process of restoring all things back to the way He created them in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Now, if you're wondering where I got this idea that the whole Bible message is summarized with the theme restoration, I get it from the apostles themselves. Look at what they said in Acts chapter 3 verse 21. Whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all the things about which God spoke by the mouth of His holy prophets long ago. You see, the apostles were saying that God is in the process of restoring all things back to the way He intended, and this is the main message throughout the Old Testament prophets and continues on in the time of the apostles. In fact, when we take a closer look at Genesis chapter 3, and we look at the different curses, we begin to see what God is going to restore in the rest of the Bible. Genesis chapter 3 is often called the fall. This is where sin is introduced into the world. This is where we see the effects of sin on our bodies, the world, and our relationships. But what we begin to realize is that the introduction of sin, which is also called curses, is actually a frustration of God's original design. In other words, what sin does is that it frustrates what God intended to be good and perfect. And so let's look at Genesis chapter 3 at the different curses God gives to the serpent, Eve, and Adam to show what the rest of the Bible is going to comment on when talking about the restoration of all things. First, let's look at the curse given to the serpent. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise your heel. One of the things we will notice is that the structure of this section is that God is going to give a curse, but then he's going to follow it with a form of grace. In other words, God says here's one of the effects of sin, but here's how he is going to restore it in the very next verse. So the curse for the serpent is that he shall be on his belly and he shall eat dust continually. But then notice how God is going to respond to this curse in the process of restoring all things. Notice the phrase that the serpent will bruise the heel of the son of Eve, while the son of Eve will crush his head or bruise his head. Now you might be wondering how this explains the process of restoration. Well, this is what theologians call the first gospel. In other words, this prophecy points to the gospel event when Jesus will die on the cross. How? You see, the way people were crucified is that there will be a big nail that goes through their heels to nail them to the cross. And so Jesus' heel was bruised by a nail on the cross. But it is through this very event that Jesus himself will bruise the head of the serpent and defeat him forever. So we see that the curse given to the serpent is followed by God's restoration plan to restore all things through the descendant of Eve who will bruise the serpent's head. Now let's move on to the curse God gives to Eve. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain and childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now I want to remind you again that the curse is not God introducing something new, but frustrating the original design. So childbearing itself is not the curse. Because back in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, God already commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. But the frustration now that is introduced because of sin is that Eve will experience pain in childbearing. And so if this is a curse, then what is God's response of grace in his restoration plan for Eve? He says, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. Now, theologians often debate this phrase. Many of them believe that the desire refers to Eve's sinful desire to want to rule over her husband, and so there's going to be a fight between Adam and Eve over who rules the family. However, I don't think that that's the right way to read it. Instead, I think God is commenting on the curse that he just introduced, that there will be pain in childbearing. So think about it. If it's going to be very painful for women to give birth, how will society continue? How will the population increase? How would they be fruitful and multiply if it's that painful? Because after the first time, wouldn't the woman just decide that she's never going to give birth to another child if it's that painful? Well, here's a form of grace God introduces. The word desire can also refer to the woman's sexual desire for her husband. In other words, God will make the process of reproduction pleasurable to the woman, even though the process of childbearing will be painful. You see, one thing to realize is that Adam's authority over Eve is not a result of sin or the fall, since Adam already had authority over Eve before Genesis 3. Let me give you some evidence for this. We know according to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, Paul mentions that Adam was created first, implying his headship. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, Adam had a protective role. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 through 17, Adam had a teaching role. And later in verse 23 of chapter 2, Adam names Eve just like he names all the other animals, which implies his authority over Eve. And so the curse is not that Eve is fighting for authority, because that's already been established before Genesis chapter 3. The curse is that Eve will experience pain in childbearing, but the grace God gives to help with the process of restoration is that God will give Eve a desire, a sexual desire, to continue to reproduce with Adam, even though it's a painful process. Now let's move on to Adam's curse. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So what is the curse for Adam? Again, the curse is not that he should work, because God already told him back in chapter 1, verse 28, to exercise dominion over creation, implying that he would have worked even before the fall. Again, the curse is a frustration to God's original design. And that frustration is that now his work will be fruitless. In pain, he will eat. He will eat by the sweat of his brow. In other words, he will not experience a fruitful work, and sometimes his efforts will come back with thorns and thistles. So what would help Adam to continue working in a fruitless environment on a sin-cursed earth? What is the grace God will provide? Well, the grace God provides that will help with the restoration process of all things is that one day Adam will return to the ground. In other words, he is going to die, and this fruitless work and toil will end. Now, on the surface, you might think death is a grace, is a good thing. You see, I had a hard time believing that death was a blessing until I saw it up close with my father. My dad worked his entire life. He always talked about the day that he could retire and travel with his grandsons, but that day never came. You see, my dad worked even when he got diagnosed with cancer. And so he never had a break from working. And what drove him to work so hard was because he was concerned and wanted to make sure that he provided for his family even when his time was short. You see, the curse for Adam is that he is going to continue to worry and continue to work even when it's a fruitless work. And I remember my dad didn't enjoy his job that much. Instead, he always looked forward to the day when he could rest. But unfortunately, he never got to experience rest until his death. In fact, a few days before he passed away, I talked with him about what he looked forward to. And one of the things he mentions is that he's just tired of living and he wanted to go. He was looking forward to the rest that he will finally experience in God's presence. This is why I believe that the form of grace God gives to Adam and the rest of his descendants is death. Because we don't live in a world that is fruitful and satisfying. Instead, we live in a post-Genesis 3 world that is fruitless and toilsome. This is why the author of Hebrews says heaven is called our eternal rest. This is why others have said heaven is our eternal Sabbath, because God rested on the seventh day, not to physically rest, but to enjoy his creation. And until God restores this earth into a new heavens and a new earth, we will not experience our eternal Sabbath or enjoyment that God always intended from Genesis chapter 1. You see, one of the many horrible things that unbelievers will experience in hell is the fact that they will never have a time to rest. Notice this passage in Revelation chapter 14, verse 11. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. Do you notice that it says that people who experience God's judgment will never experience rest? You see, for believers, death is actually a blessing because it's the way we transition out of the sin-cursed world into our final rest with God. However, for unbelievers, they don't have a rest to look forward to. So look at the picture of unbelievers being judged in a place with no rest compared to believers who experience rest. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them." And so from the very beginning of the Bible, we see that there's a big disruption that occurs in Genesis 3. Curses are introduced to the serpent, Eve, and Adam. The serpent will be on his belly and eat dust. And because of what the serpent did, all of creation experiences sin. But God is in the process of restoring all things back to Genesis 1. And the way he does it is with the offspring of Eve who will crush the serpent's head while the serpent will bruise his heel, pointing to the death of Jesus on the cross. Then we see that for Eve, although she was already designed to give birth to children, now it's going to be a painful process. However, to counteract this painful process, God will give her a desire for a husband to continue to reproduce even though the childbearing process is painful. Finally, for Adam, he was always called to work on the land, but this time, because of sin, the land will be cursed and it will be a fruitless endeavor. But the blessing, the restoration that is going to come is that through death, one day believers will rest from their labors and be in the presence of God forever. And unfortunately, through death, unbelievers will just continue to live in this sin-cursed environment where they will never experience rest. So in light of these three curses, and especially in light of the fact that seed's offspring will reverse the effects of the fall, who is the seed that's going to come? This leads to the solution of the seed. Who is going to be the one that crushes the serpent's head? Who is going to be the offspring of Eve who will restore all things back to the way God designed? If you keep reading the story, you see that we are introduced to Adam and Eve's first son, Cain. Now, Eve expected Cain to be a fulfillment of this prophecy. And the reason why I say this is because of his name. The name literally means man-child, but the word sounds similar to the word received. So the idea of Cain's name is that it means this: I received the man. What is the man Eve is referring to? The promised seed from Genesis chapter 3. However, we know from the story of Cain and Abel that Cain is not the promised seed because he ends up murdering Abel. And obviously Abel is not the promised seed because now he's dead. So in Genesis chapter 5 verse 3, we are introduced to the next son, Seth. And the name Seth means appointed one. Again, Adam and Eve are expecting Seth to be the fulfillment of Genesis 3, the promised seed who would crush the serpent's head and restore this whole earth back to Genesis chapter 1. However, we see that it's not Seth, and we keep reading the story. Eventually, we get to Lamech, the father of Noah, and notice what Lamech says about Noah in Genesis chapter 5, verse 29. Lamech looks at Noah and says that out of the ground that God has cursed, referring back to Genesis 3, the curse given to Adam, Noah is the one who's going to bring relief. So what is Lamech saying? He believes that Noah is the one who is the descendant of Eve, who will bring relief to the rest of the world. In fact, the name Noah means to rest. This goes back to Genesis 3, where Adam will never feel rest until his death or until the descendant of Eve crushes the head of the serpent. However, we see quickly Noah's not the one. In fact, after the flood, Noah himself shows his unrighteousness when he gets drunk and he passes out naked. So we move on to the storyline. Who is the seed that is introduced in Genesis 3? Is it Abraham? Abraham is the father of faith. However, we quickly see it's not Abraham. Twice he almost gives up Sarah to another ruler in order to save himself. And so we look at Abraham's son. Is it Isaac? Well, it's not Isaac, because although he was faithful to God, he had a problem of showing favoritism. He favored his son Esau over Jacob, and even though God told him that the blessings would follow Jacob, he tried to give it to Esau. Then maybe you think it's Jacob. Well, Jacob's name means deceiver, and we see how he deceived Esau, many people in the process, including his uncle. And maybe it might be Joseph, the son of Jacob, the favored son of Jacob. However, we see Joseph gets enslaved and goes to Egypt, and the story keeps continuing on. Who is this promised seed of Eve? Is it Moses? I don't think so, because he killed a man with his bare hands, and he had an anger problem later on and broke the tablets. Maybe it's the greatest king in Israel, King David. No, he had a problem too, because he killed one of his best friends in order to take his wife. Maybe it's Solomon, the wisest king of Israel. Not him either, because he had 1,000 different women as his wives and concubines, and he worshiped different idols. And as you read these Old Testament stories, the point of them is not to see them as examples. It's to see them as the failed fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3. Even the greatest king, even the great prophets, even the great patriarchs, none of them are the seed from Eve that actually crushed Satan's head. In fact, all of them fall to Satan's temptation at some point. All of them have their cracks. It isn't until we get to the New Testament where John the Baptist points to Jesus and says that he is the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. And we see how Satan starts to tempt Jesus, looking for the same cracks he was able to find with everybody else beforehand. But this time, Satan can't beat this man. Jesus resists Satan's temptation, and from that point forward in his ministry, we see how he is the perfect priest, king, and prophet. He is the perfect one who never fails like the rest of the people in the Old Testament. He is the one who is the seed from Eve, who crushes the serpent's head with his heel, even though his heel gets bruised by the serpent. In fact, we see how Jesus is the seed who finally restores all things back to the way God intended. Look at what the Apostle Paul says in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Do you notice that there was a certain point where Jesus had to be born? He was born from a woman because he's fully human. He was born under the law because he had to fulfill the law and its righteousness. And through his death and resurrection, he gives his righteousness to whoever trusts in him and redeems them so that anybody who believes in Jesus can become a child of God. And so the way Jesus crushes the serpent's head is through his death and resurrection. And because of his death and resurrection, we see that God begins the process of restoring all things back. Jesus' resurrection body is a picture of the future restoration our bodies will go through, according to the Apostle Paul. The earth that was destroyed by the flood and affected by sin eventually will be restored with the new earth that will have no seas. The divisions and the wars that we see today eventually will be replaced with world peace when the Prince of Peace, Jesus himself, returns to earth and to reign. You see, Jesus is not just a descendant of Eve. We also see from John chapter 1 verse 1, he is also equal to God himself. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created it perfectly. And the person who was there with the Father and the Spirit who created all things perfectly," the Apostle John makes commentary, "is the Word of God. In the beginning was a Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Jesus is the Word incarnate or in flesh who was with the Father from the beginning. And Jesus is the one who is going to be used by the Father to restore all things back to the way he intended. In fact, Jesus expected his disciples to be able to look at the Old Testament and see how all the clues pointed to himself. Much like Harry Potter, where we see all the clues that Harry must die one day, we also see that Jesus expected all of us to look at the Old Testament and see the same clues that pointed to the fact that he must die one day. Remember the story about the disciples after Jesus' death who walked to Emmaus? Jesus encounters them in his resurrected body, and he begins to show them how everything in the Old Testament pointed to himself. Look at Luke chapter 24, verse 27. "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning him." Jesus showed these two disciples that the Messiah had to first die before he could establish his kingdom through Israel forever. And Jesus seems to indicate that all of this can be seen with certain clues in the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament sets the stage for Jesus, who is the fulfillment of Genesis 3, the seed from Eve, who will crush the serpent's head, who will reverse the effects of the fall, who will bring rest to a sin-cursed earth, and who will end the need for painful reproduction from the time of Eve. In fact, later we see that the apostles themselves understood that all of the Old Testament gave clues that pointed to the cross of Christ in Acts chapter 26, verses 22 to 23. "To this day, I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said will come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he will proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles." In fact, earlier, the apostle said in Acts chapter 2, verses 22 to 23, that the crucifixion was not a plan B or plan C from God. It was the original plan God had because of the curse of Genesis 3. "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God." You see, this was the plan from the very beginning. We see that God knew that sin will enter into the world. He knew that sin will break this world, cause relationships to deteriorate. He knew that sin will bring pain into childbirth. He knew that sin will make this earth a fruitless earth, so that every one of us do not find our ultimate meaning in our jobs. None of us are fully satisfied because we live in a post-Genesis 3 world. However, God is in the plan of restoring all things back to the way he intended.